closing my eyes to change it, I refuse to see. The bigger the fool, the harder the fall.
Welcome back to the Mike Nowak Show with Peggy Malecki. And Kathleen might appreciate that song because she's been watching the Ken Burns series on country music. Yeah. That's Kris Kristofferson. And the reason I'm playing that is because Guy McPherson has several Kris Kristofferson songs on his website. And you can go to Nature Bats Last. It's actually, I believe, GuyMcPherson.com, right, Guy?
That's correct, yes.
And welcome back to the show. What is your fascination with Kris Kristofferson?
Well, I don't know. I grew up listening to him. I think he's a fantastic poet. And the best part about it is I can sing along. Anybody can sing along, and it doesn't really degrade the quality of the voice experience.
Well, I thought you were going to say anybody can sing at least as well as Kris Kristofferson. But what they cannot match is his songwriting.
That's exactly right. He's an astonishing songwriter, and so many of his words seem fitting to my life and have since I was 8 years old.
Brilliant songwriter. So welcome to the show. And by way of introduction, and it is McPherson, right? Not McPherson?
Exactly. And in fact, when people pronounce it McPherson, it's just an opportunity for continued defamation. Look, he's McPherson.
Oh, dear.
Okay. A scientist and professor emeritus of natural resources and ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Arizona. You've written more than a dozen books and hundreds of peer-reviewed articles, blogger, cultural critic. You co-host your own show, your own radio show. You don't need to be on this one, Guy. You're on Nature Bats Last. And just this month, Guy McPherson received the Jazz for Peace Honorary Ambassador Award. Past recipients include United States Congressional Representative Dennis Kucinich and American historian Howard Zinn. And I'll tell you, personally, I wouldn't mind being in the same company with Howard Zinn.
It's pretty good company, I'd say.
So congratulations on that.
Congrats.
Thank you.
So the last time you were on this, and Peggy tells me that you posted that you were on with me March 30th, 2014. I had
This was, he didn't post it recently. This was in something else you had posted a while back.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah. So you did that. You were looking for me. I wasn't looking for me. I was looking for other stuff because I didn't exactly remember the date. I thought it was 2014, but so here we are, 5 years down the road. And what I want to ask you is what's changed in 5 years, but keep that in mind. But before we do that, I was lying awake early this morning thinking, okay, how do I open this conversation with Guy? We've talked about this before. I'm aware of your writings. I'm aware of the fact that you're controversial. But there are people listening to the show right now millions who have never heard of you. And I'm not saying millions of people listening to the show. I'm just saying there's millions of people who had not heard of you, have not heard what you write and know what your viewpoints are. So I have to have you lay that out very briefly so we have a frame of reference for this conversation. So you can give me a 2, 3, 4, 5-minute elevator speech if you want, because I know if folks go to Nature Bats Last, and I wrote this on my blog yesterday, you could get sucked down a rabbit hole and never come out because you have so many links, you have so much information. You could be studying that site for weeks, and then of course you would want to Google or go to a search engine and find references about the things you write about, because if you're going to check what Guy has to say, you want to check what other people have to say about the same thing. So what would that elevator speech be to somebody who has never heard you before?
Well, the really short version is from February 2018, when Dan Coates, Director of National Intelligence in the Trump administration, said that we are in the midst of abrupt climate change. Add that together with the headline from the Telegraph in Great Britain from 2 days ago, which reads, "Climate change now irreversible due to warming oceans, UN body warns." That's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. You add those two together, abrupt climate change, irreversible climate change. We're in the midst of abrupt, irreversible climate change. So that's the very short version of the story. The somewhat longer version of the story, rooted in evidence, is that there's a December 26, 2018 peer-reviewed paper by Burke and colleagues in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It relies upon the IPCC's representative concentration pathways, which have repeatedly proven too conservative when compared to actual changes. And that paper concludes we're headed for a Pliocene climate as early as 2030. So that's how rapidly we are warming the planet given this set of living arrangements. Civilization is a heat engine based on the laws of thermodynamics. And yet, look at the other side of the coin. What if we manage to slow or turn off civilization, industrial civilization? That, in fact, warms the planet even faster because of something called the aerosol masking effect, or global dimming. A paper published in Science by Daniel Rosenfeld and colleagues on February 8th of this year suggests, and then in an interview, Daniel Rosenfeld further reiterates the point, less than a 20% reduction in industrial activity will drive a global average temperature rise of 1 degree Celsius within a matter of days or weeks. The vast majority of life on Earth cannot keep up with that rate of change. So we're warming the planet with this set of living arrangements, industrial civilization, whatever you want to call it, and slowing this set of living arrangements heats the planet even faster. It's the doomed if you are, doomed if you do, doomed if you don't scenario, basically.
Okay. End the show, everybody. Good night. Turn out the lights. That part of it is, to me, Guy, very scary. The idea that we could try to stop industry and get airplanes out of the skies. And you say airplanes cause a lot of this problem. Is that right?
Right. Yes, absolutely.
And you're not, let's be clear here. You're not talking about chemtrails, all right? Chemtrails,
No.
Yeah, that's tinfoil hat stuff. Where people believe that the government is conducting secret experiments to change the weather, alter mankind, humanity, I guess. And you're saying, no, it's just a function of having so many airplanes in the skies at one point. That what is that doing to our atmosphere?
Well, the contrail effect is very short term, and this was observed on September 14th, 2001, when planes in the United States were grounded for 3 days. And a profound change in the temperature of the Earth resulted in only 3 days because of the relative absence of contrails in the atmosphere very quickly. But that contrail effect is different from the greenhouse gas effect. So, and I don't want to go down that path because it's probably too much information to cover in the short time we have here.
Mm-hmm.
But at least temporarily, those contrails protect us from incoming radiation, much like the aerosol masking effect does, or global dimming. Those particulates associated with global dimming are not the same as the ones associated with contrails. So you can see how this gets a little messy.
Yeah, it does.
Contrails that serve to not only keep the planet protected from additional warming, but they also warm the planet by retaining nighttime temperatures at a high level. So let's keep this relatively simple. If we continue with greenhouse gas emissions, we'll obviously continue to warm the planet. We were warned in 2006 by James Hansen that we only have 10 years to fix this. We didn't. We were warned by the New York director of the United Nations Environment Program in 1989 that we had 10 years left. We didn't fix anything. In fact, in the last 25 years, we've added more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere than in our entire run as a species before that. So we're not slowing things down. And due to the knowledge of the aerosol masking effect, that's probably a good thing. And the last 15 presidents, by the way, have known about the aerosol masking effect. The first paper on the topic came out in 1929. So we've known about this for a long time. It's one of those bits of information that is not well distributed, we'll say, not well published, not promulgated by governments or corporate media, that sort of thing.
Why?
Because, and I wrote about this in my latest paper in September issue of the, what's it called? Clinical Psychology Forum, peer-reviewed journal, Clinical Psychology Forum. Why would we not be told? Well, if we're not told, then certain people can continue to push the message of we need to conserve. But we've known since 1865, when William Stanley Jevons wrote his book, The Coal Question. We've known about Jevons Paradox. There's basically no such thing as conservation. So if you and I conserve, you and me and the entire middle class and a whole bunch of people in other countries can conserve the use of a finite material, other people will use that same material. I think you can see where this is going. If I don't use it, you will use it. If we don't use it, the 1% will use it. What's not to like? So promulgating the idea of conservation, and bear in mind, I'm a conservation biologist. I was in the School of Natural Resources and the Environment. For years, I taught the good news about conservation, but when we're talking about a large population with a finite material, it doesn't play out. The other side of Jevons Paradox is the more efficient we become at using any finite material, the faster we use it up. Mm-hmm. So what happened in the wake of 2008, the global financial crisis? Automobile engines became more efficient. And what did they do with the efficiency? They didn't improve fuel efficiency. They added more power to the engines. So the big motor companies made the engines more powerful because we have harnessed that efficiency. So where this leads is to an absolute mess. We've been misinformed or uninformed about the aerosol masking effect since at least 1929 for the last 90 years. Why have we not been told? I suspect it's because certain people stand to benefit in ways that the rest of us won't.
You know, you talk about the use of materials. A couple of years ago, we had a friend of mine on the show who's written a book about aluminum, and he calls it Aluminum Upcycled. And one of his points was that we're really good at recycling aluminum. It's some of the original, once we figured out how to get the element in a state where we could use it, which was the early 1900s, some of that same aluminum is still being recycled because it's that efficient a process. However, at the same time, we're still mining for aluminum at ever greater rates. So it doesn't do us any good to recycle it if we're going to keep mining it, because it's an extremely destructive process.
And remember in the 1960s when we were told reduce, reuse, recycle in that order, because that's the order that matters. If we reduce as individuals, we get everybody around us to reduce their consumption, and then we reuse the materials we have, recycling becomes irrelevant. Why are we only recycling? Because that makes money for a few people, a lot of money for a few people. Mm-hmm. But in the grand scheme of things, it's, relatively unimportant. That's not to say I don't recycle. It's not to say that I don't reduce. It's not to say I don't reuse. I do all of those things, but I know the futility of the exercise. That brings me to, I'm constantly pointed out as being the bad person because I'm, quote, encouraging inaction from people or whatever, that I'm actually encouraging people to use materials faster. I want to quote Viktor Frankl from his 1946 book, Man's Search for Meaning, which was very influential for me when I first read it 30 years ago. And I've recently come across again this paragraph. Between a stimulus and a response, there is a space. In that space is the power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. The last of human freedoms is to choose one's attitude in any set of circumstances. I'm providing the stimulus here. You and I, Mike, and also Peggy, are providing the stimulus. It's the stimulus. We're providing this information to people. Between the stimulus and the response, what might be viewed in some cases as a knee-jerk reaction, is a space. I would encourage people to not use the knee-jerk reaction. In that space is the power to choose our response. Think about it. How are you going to respond? I'm merely presenting evidence here published in the peer-reviewed literature. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. The last of human freedoms is to choose one's attitude in any set of circumstances. I would say we have something else going on too.
Mm-hmm.
We get to choose our actions, not just our attitudes in the face of this information. How are you going to act now that you know, now that it's been confirmed, something you knew since you were 11, that you were given a terminal diagnosis at birth?
Really good point. And that takes us to what it is that you believe, which is that we've crashed through all of the stop signs, and we're at the point of no return, and we'd better figure out how to deal with it. In fact, you put an argument for hospice. Mm-hmm. It's time to pursue hospice as a planet, is what you say, and you said that in a speech several months ago. You've got 60 seconds. We'll break for a short time and then get right back. But briefly, how would you explain living life in hospice?
Yeah, in my May 2019 article in Clinical Psychology Forum, again, the peer-reviewed journal article, I point out how we might pursue hospice, planetary hospice. And basically it comes down to this. What do people do when they're in hospice? They tell the truth. They tell every version of the truth. They complete relationships in their lives. If I'm going to die in a month or 6 months or a year, I'm not going to lie to you anymore. I'm going to tell you I love you. I'm going to seek your forgiveness, and so on.
Okay, we'll be right back with Guy McPherson.
Every hard rock and wreck on the highway, every heartbroken rule of the road, every true thing we wrote on the wind is still singing. Love is the last thing to go.
Welcome back to the Mike Nowak Show with Peggy Malecki, another Kris Kristofferson song, again, that I found on the website Nature Bats Last. As I said on my blog, if you get all the way to the bottom, you don't have to believe everything Guy says. You don't have to understand it. You probably won't. I'm not a scientist. I don't understand everything. I think it's worth reading. I think it's worth getting into your brain, given that this is a point of view you don't hear that often. All right, you hear the climate change skeptics. They're out there. You hear the middle of the roaders. They're out there. You don't hear this very often, which is we're screwed. And we need to address that somehow. And the way that Guy McPherson does is, as you say in your site, love. It's live a good, full life. Do what you can right now, knowing how that's going to play out.
Yeah, and the difficult part for me and most other people is living with urgency in light of the terminal diagnosis we were given at birth, and continuing to live with urgency because it's exhausting. Yeah. If you have something you call a bucket list, if you have relationships you want to complete, if you want to apologize to somebody and seek forgiveness, and you ratchet that up to every relationship in your life, if you want to tell those people that you love them and now is the time to say goodbye. I've been doing this for 16 years or 17 years or so, and it's exhausting. It was Homer in the Iliad who wrote, "Any moment might be your last." And he was writing about how spectacular it is to be humans and have any moment maybe your last. And he pointed out before then that the gods envy us because they have to do it every day. And having done it every day for the last 17 years, I promise you it's exhausting. It's also very fulfilling. It's also gratifying to go into the world and acknowledge that I might never be able to take out the garbage again. I might never be able to do the laundry again. We view those as mundane tasks, and they are, but there's also some beauty in them. How many people in the history of the world have ever had a washing machine, for example, to wash their clothes? How many people in the history of the world have ever had a garbage can? You just put your garbage in there and then it magically disappears 3 days later when this big truck comes along and hauls it away. You know,
That's part of
Yeah.
our problem, Guy. All right. As you know, there's no such thing as a way.
absolutely.
But we grew up believing that, especially in the United States. So we're a very privileged country, and it's good for people to understand how privileged they've been to live here. But you have a lot of critics out there. And
Really?
I don't know. I'm just guessing.
One or two.
And one of the tamer criticisms came actually from Skeptical Science, who called you an alarmist a couple of years ago. They write, there are a few reasonably well-known individuals who could accurately be described as climate alarmists. The most prominent is Guy McPherson, who decided in 2002 that climate change would likely drive humans to extinction by 2030. 16 years later, we're now more than halfway to 2030, and the global human population has grown from 6.3 billion to 7.6 billion. It's quite safe to say we won't go extinct in the next few decades. How do you respond to that?
Really? That's what Francis Bacon called the idol of the den. IDOL, the idol of the den. Just because it hasn't happened, therefore it won't happen. Really? That makes logical sense to you? Then I don't think you belong in a scientific, rational conversation, period. You know, there's a lot of things that are happening right now that people said could never happen. For example, people fleeing Central America, where I lived for about 2.5 years, because they no longer have habitat for humans there, because they're unable to grow food. People fleeing the Middle East and Northern Africa. I was on tour in Western Europe more than 5 years ago, and the average European was outraged at the flood of immigrants coming in from the Middle East and Northern Africa. People that don't look quite like us were invading the country. How about the South Pacific, where island nations are going underwater? So people are fleeing for their lives there. The list goes on. These are the kinds of things that people said would never happen, and yet they're happening. How's this one for you? In the last 4 years, there have been 5 tropical storms in the Atlantic. That's never happened before. Oh, in fact, there are 5 hurricanes, category 4 or more. That's never happened before. There's all kinds of things happening around the planet that have never happened before. One of the near-term things that is almost certain to happen within the next few years is an ice-free Arctic. Ask any scientist when that will occur, and I doubt if you get a response that goes beyond 2030, because it's clear that we are very near an ice-free Arctic event now.
Yeah, well, you know, we had one of the scientists claimed it would have happened by now, and he's taking some heat, no pun intended, because it hasn't happened at this point. And this is what happens and that's the danger, I guess, of making predictions. We have a meteorologist on our show, Rick DeMaio, who says, I don't want to go more than a week out, because you really get into shaky territory.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, absolutely. And Wisław Maslowski is the person you're talking about. He was the lead author on a paper in the journal Annual Review of Earth and Planetary Sciences, came out in 2012. And what the article pointed out by him and 3 other co-authors was a projection, not a prediction that's been misunderstood as a prediction, but it was actually a projection based on existing data. If we continue a linear decline with respect to the ice in the Arctic, then we could expect an ice-free Arctic in 2016, plus or minus 3 years. So they were just projecting based on the information they had, which at the time only went up to 2007. And so I had a conversation with Maslowski a few months ago, and he pointed out that we have better tools now. And so they don't predict an ice-free Arctic to occur within that time frame, including 2019, which is the last of the 7 years that would have fit into that time frame.
Mm-hmm.
But we also need to recognize that the research by Natalia Zhukova and colleagues pointing to a tremendous release of methane from the Arctic is not dependent upon an ice-free Arctic. And that's clearly underway. You look at the methane in the atmosphere, it's gone exponential. So there's a bunch of different pieces that to me add up to an overheated planet. 410 parts, roughly 410 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, 2.5 times as much methane in the atmosphere as we had at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. That methane is being spewed by the permafrost, terrestrial permafrost, and also from the Arctic Ocean. There's all kinds of factors that have contributed to overheating the planet and will continue to do so. And I don't see much information out there about how to cool the planet. We're the hottest planet ever experienced by Homo sapiens, and we don't know how to cool the planet. That's a serious problem.
And as you mentioned, methane is a huge part of that. It's not just carbon dioxide. And you mentioned methane in the context of feedback loops. Well, would you like to explain that to folks who might not understand that concept?
Yeah, a feedback loop, or a self-reinforcing feedback loop. I like that phrase a little bit better because it tells you that it's self-reinforcing. Once you push the snowball, so you make a big snowball, for example, in the wintertime, back when we had snow, and you make it on a hill, and you get this big snowball, maybe 3 feet in diameter, and you push it down a steep hill. And the further it goes, the more snow it picks up along the way. The more snow it picks up along the way, the more inertia, the more momentum it has to continue going down the hill. All you had to do was push it. All we had to do was push it with respect to the climate system. And we did. And now the system has taken over itself. This is one of the things that the director of the New York office of the United Nations Environment Program said back in 1989. It was released by Associated Press. So you can find it in any archive of any major newspaper in the United States. He was talking about the self-reinforcing feedback loops by which the system overcomes our ability to control it. To the extent we have ever had any ability to control the climate, those days are behind us now.
You look at the Intergovernmental Panel on climate change and other political forces as slow-moving, obviously, and timid, cautious, way too cautious. What can be done, if anything? And I know this is it's an odd question to ask, given you've already said we should go into hospice. Is there anything that can be done?
Oh, yes. Not at the level of society, not at the level of government. Of course not. We have begun the process that is irreversible. We are in the midst of abrupt, irreversible climate change. There is nothing to be done about that to slow, stop, or reverse abrupt, irreversible climate change. However, we can live. There's a lot of people in this world who are going to die without ever having experienced what they wanted to do with their lives. There's a lot of people who are alive, but we look at them and it doesn't seem like they're living to me and to you, or at least not living fully, because they're trapped on a treadmill. Mm-hmm. They show up to work every day and they continue that work, and the bars that they are building, the bars that they are putting up to build their own cage, are the expectations of others. Why did I go to work all those years at an ungodly hour in the morning to stay until an ungodly hour at night? Because that was the expectation of society. That's what professors do. They're influencing young minds. They're teaching during the day and conducting research in the morning and at night. And this is the expectation that is had of what professors shall do. And so I did. And I don't think most of us realize that we are living our lives according to the expectations of others. Almost nobody would admit that. But if you think about the treadmill you've built for yourself, or maybe that society has built for you, there's probably a pretty good likelihood that you're not in complete control of what you're doing every day.
Right.
So, there's even a paper that's come out since most of the criticism launched my way. This paper was published the 13th of November, 2018. It was by a couple of biologists named Strona and Bradshaw. And the title is Co-Extinctions Annihilate Planetary Life During Extreme Environmental Change. And the extreme environmental change is 5 or 6 degrees Celsius. Well, we're almost certainly headed there with an ice-free Arctic, for example. If we destroy all life on Earth, I'd say there's a pretty good chance that includes most of us, too. most humans are alive, some a lot more than others, obviously. But if we destroy all life on Earth, we're not going to have human beings on this planet. And so that's my message. That's my warning that I've been sounding for a long time. Increasingly, my message has the support of the peer-reviewed literature. And
We
that's
need to
good
take
news
a
and bad
break.
news.
All right. We will be back with Guy McPherson. It's the Mike Nowak Show with Peggy Malecki. Welcome back to the Mike Nowak Show with Peggy Malecki. We are today the alternative to Ken Burns' country music. But that's all I got. I don't have as much as he does.
We don't have the video to go with it.
And we're talking to Guy McPherson, a professor emeritus from University of Arizona, and we're talking about the end of the world. All right, as simple as that. Can you take a phone call, Guy?
Oh, yes.
Let's put Amtrak Tim on. Amtrak Tim, I haven't heard from you in a long time. How you doing?
Pretty good. I'm doing pretty good. I'm another really uplifting show today.
Thank you. That's why
You're welcome.
I specialize in it.
We do our best.
Yeah. So, what do you want to ask Guy?
I wanted to. I know in the thorium nuclear conferences, they've been talking a lot about the idea of running about 900 thorium-based nuclear reactors and doing nothing but removing CO2 from the atmosphere. Literally, that's all they do. I'm wondering if he believes if we switch to a thorium nuclear sort of energy system, could we remove enough CO2 from the atmosphere to get ourselves to a stable situation?
And I will mention that Tim has talked to me over the years about thorium nuclear energy, so I continue to kind of keep an eye on that. I've often wondered if, Tim, this is, you don't have to answer this, but I've often wondered if it's so effective, why isn't the world gravitating to it right now? But it seems to me things have got to be better than the nuclear we have right now, which we don't have any idea what to do with the waste from. But that aside, Guy, can you answer Tim's question?
Yes, I think that's a great idea. Had we implemented it 40 or 50 years ago, it might have delayed abrupt, irreversible climate change. But we've begun that process now. We know that based on the laws of thermodynamics, civilization is the heat engine, and I suspect thorium reactors will continue to add to the heating. On September 10th, 2018, so a little more than a year ago, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said we have until 2020 to change course. 2020. As I recall, that's only a couple of months from now, maybe 3. How could we change course? There is no known way to cool the planet. Could we cool it through thorium reactors? It would surprise me. I think that's a lot better energy system than what we currently have in place. But I'm not sure that adding a bunch more energy to the system is going to solve the predicament created by adding energy to the system.
Well, you've got to remember, nuclear energy is not adding CO2 to the system. It is removing the CO2, so you're able to reduce the amount of heat that's going to be retained within the atmosphere.
Nuclear power plants are currently adding enormously to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The cooling towers created by all that concrete are not carbon neutral until at least 20 or 30 years down the road. By that time, the nuclear power plants become unsafe and we start talking about decommissioning them. Not that we ever actually decommissioned very many, but we talk about it. So to claim that nuclear energy to date has not been a contributor to carbon dioxide emissions is naive. That is just not true.
So you're saying...
Direct opposition to what the IPCC says, as well as Dr. James Hansen.
Yeah. Dr. James Hansen.
I would defer to Dr. James Hansen on the carbon neutrality of nuclear energy.
How about deferring to the evidence? How about deferring to what does it actually take to make concrete, and in terms of the carbon dioxide emissions? It's an enormous contributor to carbon dioxide emissions. Cement, concrete, it's enormous.
All right, we're going to leave it at that because I want to wrap this up. Tim, I appreciate the phone call. Let's move on to wrap this up because one of the things I did want to get to is when I announced I was going to have you on the show, I had some people warn me that this might be playing with fire. 5 years ago when I talked, I didn't feel that way at all, and it's interesting to hear it. But you engender a lot of passion, both positive and negative. That's got to be part of what makes it hard to do this every single day, I would guess.
Of course. Had I a non-existent choice, I would go back 20 years in time and not pursue the path I've been on. I've had very little impact on very few people. Promulgating this message has essentially destroyed my very privileged life. I have been defamed, betrayed, plagiarized, probably as much as anybody in modern history. None of these things are happy for me. None of these things brings me joy. If I had an opportunity to wind back the clock, I would do what everybody else does, including James Hansen, by the way, which is to lie. Lie by omission of the aerosol masking effect. Lie by omission of 6 dozen self-reinforcing feedback loops. Lie by omission about 410 parts per million being the most dangerous position we've ever been on. Lie by omission about being at least 1.7 degrees Celsius above the 1750 baseline, instead promoting the idea that we're around 1 degrees above the 1750 baseline. So, there's all kinds of things I would do differently had I to do it over again. But now that I'm here, now that I'm telling the full truth, that puts me in the position of being increasingly willing to only speak the full truth, because you can't take away from me anything that hasn't already been taken away from me, period.
Well, when I talked to you in 2014, you were living in Arizona, and you had basically given up on the comforts of life. As you say, you were defecating in a bucket. And then that, I was thinking at that time, if the earth is heating, why are you living in Arizona? But, and at the time you told me off air that it had been a mistake. And so you ended up moving to Belize, and then now you're in New York, right?
Yeah. And all of these moves of mine were based on compromise. Every relationship that we're serious about is rooted in compromise. So I established the homestead in New Mexico because of a compromise with my wife at the time. By the time I had lived there 10 years after starting the process, I realized that because of the aerosol masking effect, because of the catastrophic meltdown of more than 400 nuclear power facilities around the planet, that there was no way out. So it's time to live. Thus the move to Belize. And the move here is based on familial issues, mostly involving the near-term death of the family members of my partner. So these are the compromises we make. Would I rather be living someplace than in New York State? Yes, I absolutely would. But I do what I do out of love for the truth, out of love for human individuals. And if it shortens my life, so what? At least I'm living my principles.
Would you say, and we only have a minute left, would you say in the past 5 years that more people have begun to agree with you or have gone the opposite way?
It's difficult for me to say. I would say that the evidence certainly has become increasingly clear. There's an occasional person who is willing to agree with me in public, but only for a short time, because what happens next is not very kind to that person.
We're going to leave it at that. I want to thank you so much for talking to us again. Guy McPherson, go to Nature Bats Last. You can search that on an engine or go to guymcpherson.com. Were you going to add something there, Peggy?
OnlyLoveRemains.org is his other site.
Right, OnlyLoveRemains.org. Either of those, and read up with it, and read up with it with an open mind. Dr. McPherson, I hope we talk again soon.
Thank you, Mike and Peggy. I hope we do as well.
It's the Mike Nowak Show with Peggy Malecki.